Mhm.
So if there's any really specific questions, I might have to give we'll circle back answer. But in general, we should be able to answer most.
All right, we're live.
All right.
Hey, everybody. Um, Welcome to the Business of Writing and our presentation of the Keystone survey results. I'm going to be introducing pretty soon to Hank Marcacci from Kindlepreneur. He's a data scientist and he did an amazing job helping us take this massive amount of data and getting it into something usable. So some of the folks that are on here, you probably helped us put this data together. And if you're not familiar with it, what we did is we created this survey that um, took uh, a bunch of open ended questions around quality and appeal. And then we gave them to the authors to share in their newsletter. So this included my clients, included people in my newsletter, hundreds of authors that ended up resulting in, um, I think we had 5,600 responses. And
Quite a
uh,
few. I mean, I was surprised by the sheer amount of data, which is, I mean, as a
well,
data guy, I love it.
yeah. So let me bring Hank in here and we'll talk.
Hey, Joe, you just went on mute.
All right. Sorry about that. Um, Hit too many buttons there. So yeah, Hank, let's talk about this data and what I threw over the wall to you.
That sounds great. And Joe, just real quick, I do notice on that slideshow, we
Yeah.
just jumped to the beginning.
Yep.
But there's a ton of data that we have on here. And anytime you get this information, I mean, the more data you get, typically the better. I mean, you get to a point sometimes where it's diminishing returns, but getting those 5,000 responses were awesome. And from that data, if you want to just hit ahead one or two, Joe, but we had a couple different things that we really looked for and really tried to understand. And this is all self-reported. This is what people are saying they like, or characterizing themselves and characterizing what they enjoy. But a lot of things that we picked up were, for instance, looking at education level. Does it matter? I mean, with education, what type of genres do you enjoy? Does it matter based upon your age, whether you're male or female, your favorite genres? And then we asked a lot of open-ended questions, like Joe said, all about what makes you love books. What is it that makes you see a book and you want to say, I want to read that? Or you go and you tell all your friends about it. But there's all sorts of things here that we really dug into and we really wanted to determine based upon what you or the readers are saying, because those are the people as authors we want to listen to and we want to give you what you like to read. So that's what we dug in there. And Joe, I don't know if you had any comments there just about, any rationale you had on your side for the questions. I know we worked together on those, but the goal again is just to get what the reader feels and give them more what they would like so that you can really increase that satisfaction level.
Yeah. When we did this, we were thinking at the past survey we did, and it was very typical, right? Like, do you read KU? Do you buy books? What's your favorite genre? The same things you see in a lot of these surveys that go out there. And this time, given your skill set, we thought, well, what if we just let readers kind of riff on what they like
Right?
and
Mm-hmm.
be able to dig into that and see things that you could only get if you got all these people together and essentially a focus group.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you just go at this, and I'll be your little slide lackey.
Awesome. Hey, well, I love to talk about data, so I'm all about this. But like you said, we included open-ended questions, and those can be a lot more difficult with data because when you think about it, when you're going through data, it's very easy to just count up the number of people that say they like science fiction and say 50% do and 50% don't, or something along those lines. It's harder to take a huge paragraph response and get 5,000 of those and figure out what really matters out of that. But that's what we tried to do, and we'd be excited here to show you that today. So Joe, just go ahead and jump on through. But that's, again, those are the different categories that we collected. There's a bunch of stuff, and we're going to start off with just a general genre analysis. And here we're just trying to understand, what type of people's like what genres or how do demographics come into play here. And again, these are generalizations. This doesn't mean, that if you see something, you might hate a genre or might love it. This is just a generalization based upon the self reported data that we had coming in from those email lists. And the first thing that we saw when we looked at genres is immediately we noticed that depending upon your age, there are certain genres that you like more or you might not like as much. And there tended to be three different groupings that we found. So the first one is we found genres that the older you are, the more likely you are to enjoy it. So basically, there's certain genres that there's a young old split that if you're young, you probably won't like it, but if you're old, you'll probably love it. And we did see that go across several different genres. Now, we also saw the complete opposite of that, which is there are genres that if you're young, or go back up, Joe, real quick. But there are genres that if you're young, you really enjoyed, but the older you got, the less likely you were to enjoy it. And we'll talk through some of those, but a great example there, for example, is like lit RPG or urban fantasy. If you're young, you're far more susceptible to that genre. Whereas if you're older, you might prefer something like a mystery. And we saw those groupings occur. And then the third one that's really interesting is that there were genres that middle aged like, but if you're young or old, you couldn't stand them. So it was really interesting because you saw either it increased with your age, how much you like a genre, it decreased with your age, how much you like a genre, or there was this middle point where if you're around 35, you really enjoy it, but once you get older, you don't like it. Once you get younger, you don't like it. So those are the three different areas that we saw. And going into each of those, we'll start off with the young and old. So Joe, let's go ahead and jump into next. Or we'll start off with middle age. And when we look at middle age, what we really see here, and again, this is around 35, 40 age group is where we generally included people in this area. We saw that most of the mainstream categories were driven by this, which makes sense. I mean, it's a very wide range of ages. So, I mean, if you're coming in, and again, we're talking about probably, again, maybe not quite 35, 40, but let's say 25 to 45, but that whole grouping there, that's quite a lot of readership. And we saw, the big ones being pushed by this. We're talking about urban fiction, paranormal romance, young adult is actually in there, space opera, romance, thrillers, action, epic fantasy, like all these big ones were coming out and they were driven by middle age. And what we found out is that if you're in middle age, you're the most open minded for new genres. So when we asked everyone, we said, hey, how many genres do you like? Or pick out of this list which genres you like. Everyone that was middle age selected far more. So they would say maybe they had 8 genres that they enjoyed, but someone that was younger or someone that was older might say, I really only like 2 genres. So if you're looking at people that are reading books or trying to understand them, the closer they are to middle age, the more likely that they might go out and try something new. Whereas when we looked at younger authors, they typically, or younger readers, they typically found a reader that they really liked. And then when you looked at older readers, they typically found a genre that they really liked. So it's either they're following the author if they're younger, or if they're older, they tended to follow the genre. But if you're in the middle age, you're still in that discoverable zone. You're comfortable with what you're reading, and you're going out and exploring the world. Now, if we go look at young and old, so Joe, if we could click one.
Yeah, and a question that came in um, was women fiction included in the survey as an option? I can't remember.
Women fiction as a genre, particularly, was not, but there are options that correlate very strongly with women's fiction. So, for example, it just depends upon when you look at the genre, what you consider to exist within there. But as a very specific genre, it was not included.
Yeah. And just for
But there,
everyone, when we get to the end, I'll be showing you how you can access the raw day data. I don't know what you're going to do with it, but that's part of what we're going to be providing.
Now, looking in again, when we talked about the women's fiction area, there are plenty of ones that correlate very strongly there. Just that very specific genre, I don't think was included in that data or the questions that we asked. Now, jumping over to young and old behavior, what we saw here is that older audiences really tended to enjoy mysteries. Christian suspense was a really big one with older, historical, and westerns. And the things that they really didn't like is if you had a romance that was steamy or horror books, they typically didn't like those. So we got a lot of responses that they didn't want, rated R material for older audiences. Typically, they said that wasn't something that they looked at. Now, that could be a result of the bias of our surveys, right? We went out, we asked specific authors. So the market as a whole might react slightly different. However, that's what we saw in our data. And when you go to younger audiences, the two that they said that they loved were dark fantasy and lit RPG were two of the ones that they really picked out. And what they tended not to enjoy were memoirs. So again, you go through this area, you can see this different behavior that's characterized depending upon the age of the audience. Now, What's really interesting here is, I mean, pay attention real quick. We said that younger audiences tend to enjoy, dark fantasy. Older audiences enjoy westerns. And Joe, if you click over the slide, we'll see if the second bullet point here, which is really interesting, is that if you have an AOL email, you tend to like mystery but avoid dark fantasy. And if you remember what we just talked about, if you're an older audience, you like mystery and you don't like dark fantasy. And if you have an AOL email, that's something you enjoy. So, what's really interesting about this is that we can use something like an email address to predict whether or not someone will enjoy a genre based upon when they may have signed up for the first time they got an email. So it's really interesting because when you look at different readers, you don't just necessarily have to know, how old they are, what they might enjoy. There's a lot of factors that determine that. And there's a lot of indirect ways to say, okay, if this person, liked Westerns, they probably also like mysteries or other things that come in groupings. And it's important to remember again, these are generalizations. This isn't everyone, but this is the way that these groups tend to behave. Something else we thought was interesting is in general, young and old tended not to agree on things. So if you're young and you're old, you tended to like different genres. You really didn't see a lot of crossover. But sweet romance was one that absolutely crossed over. So we saw when you're young and old, you enjoyed that one, but almost every other genre out there, if you're young or old, you didn't tend to read the same things. So that really split up. And then the other one that was interesting as well that we saw is that with Westerns, you really only tended to enjoy those if you're 71 and up. I mean, it was like almost no one would say, hey, I like Westerns. And then as soon as you hit that 71 and up age group, it took a huge jump up. So if you are in that, if you're writing a Western, something that's important to recognize is that at least now, at least at the time this data was taken, that is the age group that really enjoys it. And it's just not getting a lot of traction with others. It's not to say that can't change in the future, but that's based upon the survey that we currently see.
Yeah, and just to interject here, we had a real interesting mix of authors. Like some of were my clients that have extremely big lists, and then other folks were smaller authors that maybe only had a few thousand names or 500 names. Like anybody could participate. So we had a wide breadth of different size authors and people writing in just about every genre you could imagine.
Agreed. And something important to remember too is when we look at this data will be affected by, which authors we were able to send out with their lists. So, for example, if one author had 10,000 emails they're sending out to, and all of those authors' fans really enjoy dark fantasy or really enjoy lit RPG, that's going to weight the results a little more there. So, it's very important when you look at surveys to know that there's always going to be some bias inherent in that survey. All right. So the next thing we took a look at is how by gender this actually splits up. So you can see looking at male and female through self-reported analytics, how that actually splits. And we'll jump into these a little more, but it's interesting to see that there are certain ones that are very driven by male. There's certain ones that are very driven by female. And then there's a lot in the middle. And so, I mean, you look at, for example, almost all of the romance genres are driven primarily female. Almost all science fiction are primarily male, but there is a split that occurs there. And it's interesting too, because every one of these you can see again, your audience group is going to be made up of some percentage of the two. There's nothing that it's only male or only female. It's just a question of what percentage does that split up in comparison. So again, these are all the genres we looked at and how they looked. And what was interesting too is that the more mainstream your genre typically would have a mix of both around 50-50. So you see thrillers, historical, even action adventure. Action adventure is a little more male, but a lot of these you look in, and the ones that are mainstream have that mix. Whereas a couple of the other big mainstream ones might be dominated, such as romance or epic fantasy, might go and skew one way or the other. But when you look at mainstream, there's no clear dominance on one male or female bias or leaning compared to the other. And just calling out a couple of the ones that we noticed is that female driven genres tended to be romance and Christian suspense. So when I say romance, there's a group of probably 10 different romances that we asked about. Those are all combined in there, but those are all almost followed that general behavior. And Christian suspense also behaved that way as well. And then male driven, we saw typically sci fi, military, space opera ones, anything along those lines tended to be male driven, as well as epic fantasy and lit RPG. In epic fantasy and lit RPG, we saw a lot of similar behavior as well. So those two can be grouped together and sci-fi can be grouped together. But that was a lot of the split that we actually saw occur there. And some interesting callouts that we noticed is that, in general, people enjoyed mysteries, whether they were male or female. Both of them equally enjoyed that. However, cozy mysteries tended to be female based. So if you enjoy cozy mysteries, chances are that you're more likely a female if you're in that area. And then romance was female based, but what was interesting is we saw that sci fi romance was an even split. And where I think that potentially occurs is we look and we see that romance is female driven, science fiction is male driven, and I think this is where they meet in the middle. So they have that genre that they can both enjoy there, and that is why we get that even split coming out in sci fi romance. And that was again when we went through the different genres, how we characterize them. But we're also going to take a look at our discovery or book discovery. And the question here now is if you're a reader, where do you find your next book? If you're looking around and you're trying to decide that you want something new, what do you actually pick up off the shelf? And this is what we found. And we went ahead and we characterized this in a couple different areas. So, Joe, if you could slip to the side there, basically how we find new books. And these are the different areas that we were able to find. So the different options that we had, one example is Goodreads. Those are people that go on, they're looking at their lists, reviews, the social aspects, everything on Goodreads. We looked at advertisements. So anytime you're on Amazon, Amazon says, hey, check out this book, you might love it. Or you see that Facebook ad that pops up and says, hey, you might really like this book because you like these other five. That's an example of advertisements. Newsletters are potential another way, and that's typically author controlled or through something like BookBub. So either you're following an author and they're saying, I love this book, or BookBub or someone is saying there is a huge discount on this, you should check it out. People also looked at similar authors, and the idea being there is that if you liked an author, you'll like them again, or if you liked one author, you'll like one that's very similar to them. And then we also looked at bookstores. So people that would go into, for example, Barnes and Noble, walk down the store, look at what Barnes and Noble is showing them, or just peruse the shelves. And the last one that we saw a lot of as well is uncertainty, where people actually said, I don't really know where I find a book. It just kind of appears, I pick it up and I read it. And they don't have a specific avenue that they go down, but there's a whole bunch of different areas that they might look at and enjoy. And looking at these, we're able to split it up in several different groups. And here's our results on this next page that we were able to show. So, splitting between women and men, we saw that they were far more likely, if you're a woman, to find books on Goodreads, ads, and newsletters. Those are the different areas that you said that you really like to find books and where we would actually go to seek them out. With men, we actually saw there was an uncertainty of where to find books, so they didn't really know where they were going to go, but they have this desire to expand their horizons. So they'd say, I don't know where I'm going to get a new book, but I want them. I want to find new books. I want to find new ones I'm really going to enjoy, but I'm just not certain where I can actually discover that. So that was interesting to me because really it says that there is that desire, there is that drive, but not necessarily a specific way for them to fulfill that. When we looked at age between young, middle, and old age, we noticed that young authors or young readers tend to follow authors. So they would go and they look for a book with similar authors or buy the same author. And there's a lot of loyalty with young readers where if they like an author, they're going to read their whole list or they're going to go through and really stick with them the whole time. With middle age, we saw that they like to go into bookstores, but they also like Goodreads and they also liked newsletters. So while they like the physical store, they're willing to go into things that are going to suggest them directly from the author or from those social sites. And then with our older audiences, they tended to say that they really liked advertisements. So they actually liked it when Facebook ads popped up and suggested them a book that they would look for or online suggestions. So that's really when we go to the older audience, what they're looking for. And what we were able to distill from this is that typically, if you're a younger audience, you tend to be more loyal to the author. You find an author you like and you follow them and you stick with them. If you're an older audience, you tend to be more loyal to your method. So you find a method that looks for you. So whether it's an ad or a newsletter or whatever it is, and you stick with that and you tend to stick with the genre. So there's that split there where if you're younger again, you follow the author. If you're older, you tend to follow the genre, or where you found one good book before, you tend to think that you're going to find another good book in that same area or method as prior. And if we could switch, yep, thank you. And then after this,
Just real quick,
sure,
some folks are putting some comments up, and we'll get to these towards the end and kind of answer some of this stuff, but just for the kind of keeping things coherent, and because there's the lag on the live, it's probably better that we just catch those later and just I'll go through them with you.
sounds great. Going in next, we looked at our open text analysis. What this means is that whenever someone sent us when we ask a question that asks for a paragraph answer or asks for a long answer, this is how we actually go through and identify the answers there. And realistically, when we ask these questions, we're trying to get to the bottom of what are readers looking to find within books? What makes them love a book? what makes them not enjoy a book, and what makes them, tell their friend, hey, this is a book you have to check out. Also, we were really interested in readers understanding in readers what they want more of. What do you not see on the market that you really want to find? And this is what we're able to discover. So the first question we have is, what qualities do all your favorite books have in common? And you'll see this throughout all of our other questions, but something that we saw time and time and time again were characters. So all your favorite books have strong, good characters, and we see that time and time again. So what this word cloud is again is when we take all your responses and we pull out the most popular words, that's what's popping up here in large as answers to this question. And again, characters far bigger than anything else, and people are saying over and over again that's what they like. There's a secondary emphasis on plot and story. So people are saying, hey, I like a good character. I also like the plot and story, but characters are significantly larger. That is something that people are really asking for and really want to find in their next favorite books. And then we also had a lot of other minor items, such as looking for romance, looking for twists, looking for clean books, or looking for action. There's a whole bunch of other minor ones. But again, throughout our whole analysis, what everyone agreed upon is they want good characters and they want good stories, are two things that they look for in their favorite books. Now, what we did is we split this across gender or male and female, and we determined that there's really not a strong bias here either way. Both male and female say they want good characters, they want a good plot, and they want a good story. So we saw that being consistent. It's not like one is asking for one and the other is asking for something else. We did see a little bit of a difference in asking for clean versus, something that might be steamy. So there's a little bit there, as well as romance. But in general, that is how that laid out. We go to the next one, Joe.
One quick thing in this, we in talking about this data, we know that some of that bias on the clean may be because of authors that were more clean romance having bigger lists and more responses. So just keep that in mind if you're watching this data. If you're in a genre that is typically really steamy, that doesn't mean go clean, right? Like
Very true. Yep. That it's all about the bias in the authors. And one thing I just noticed here, I think I made an accident here. I'm colorblind, so I apologize for this. But male and female do look switched. So in this one below or above, the colors are switched. It should be the other way around. But basically, again, the core root lesson here of that they both are tending to ask for the same things stays true. Now, the other thing we wanted to look at is based upon age group, how they behaved. So this basically says if you're between 18 and 30, or 31 to 40, or 41 to 55, or the other age groups as well, what you tend to look for and what you ask for more. So for example, if we look at characters, you can trace out that if you're 18 to 30, you're asking for better characters. But if you're 41 to 55, you're really asking for better characters. And that dies off as the genre or as the readership gets older as well. We see the same thing occur with story, which is that pink line there, how story is actually behaving. With romance, we tended to see younger audiences asking for that more. And then when we talked about clean as well, you could see clean is increasing as you get older. So there's a different, when you look at this again, you generally see that, again, story and characters are the highest. It peaks at middle age, but there are certain things that depend upon age, such as romance and such as clean, which act inversely. And again, this is likely based upon the bias of, the author or the bias upon their email groups, but that's what we saw coming out in our data. Now, looking for the steps that you would take to find a new book, what we discovered is that there's a lot of different areas that people can look into trying to find their next book. And what really popped out to us was authors. So a lot of people said, hey, I liked one author. That means I'm going to like their next book. Another one is series. So if you read book one of a series, you're going to love book two. So they'd stick that as well. And genre. So if you read something in a very specific genre or Amazon category, that's where you're actually going to go out and search for your next book there. The other area we saw was socials. So that's lists, looking on Facebook, recommended, or Goodreads. Those are all things that pop up when they're looking for their next book. And then we saw things that talked about quality. So they said I'd look at the reviews or I'd read the description. People love a good cover. And they said if it has a great cover, it really catches my eye, as well as the blurb. So if the author goes in and really writes an awesome blurb, that's going to hook someone in to read. But the big one we saw, again, we're looking at authors and sticking with that author or sticking with that genre were really the highlights there. The next question was, what would make you recommend a book to your friend? And it was funny here because a lot of the answers that we got just said if it's a good book or if I love it, which is great to hear. I mean, if you love a book or you really enjoy it, you'd recommend that to a friend. And that's, one of the surface level answers we got there. But what we really found interesting here was that there was an emphasis of story over characters. So if you remember early on, people said they wanted to read more about good characters. They wanted awesome characters. That's really what they want in their books. But it's interesting because when we asked what would make you recommend a book to your friend, people would say it's a good story. So there's a little bit of a difference here that's interesting, and that might just be in the way the language comes out. But again, we see that character and stories are coming in. It's just a question of which one's the height for recommending it to a friend. And something that was interesting is we didn't see a lot of information about editing or price. People typically don't say, "Hey, here's a book that's really cheap. You should read it," or "Hey, this is a book that's incredibly well edited." Those are typically not things that they use to recommend to friends. But again, those are things that may make you not recommend it to a friend. If a book is $50, you may not recommend it. Or if a book is terribly edited and there's spelling mistakes everywhere, that might prevent you as well, right? But those aren't things that are necessarily going to drive that behavior. Next is what signals to you that a book might be worth your time. And again, we saw here author loyalty. So if the same author wrote it, and that's another theme that we see time and time again, if you love one author and they write another book, you're likely going to go out and buy the next. And there's a lot of reasons behind that. And one is because you like their writing style. But the other thing, too, is once you read one author, Amazon knows. So Amazon's going to say, hey, this author wrote a new book. Goodreads knows. They'll let you know there as well. Newsletters if you follow your newsletter. So there's a lot of reasons. It's not just that I like this author, I'm going to the next. It's that you're more likely to hear about them as well because people already know that you enjoy it and they'll reach out to you and say, hey, book 2 is out, or there's a sequel, or this author just came out with something new. The other things as well were perceived quality. So if your book had a killer review, if it had great descriptions, cover, blurb, those are all things there. And then people also said recommendations. So if a friend comes up and says, hey, you have to read this book, it's incredible, they're more likely to go there as well. What's interesting here is that the signals for a good book did not have character or story in it. And this makes sense because when you think about it, it's very difficult to tell if a book has a great character or a great story when you're just looking at the cover or you're trying to read the description. So it's hard to be able to tell that off of the surface level values. They may not be a signal that you'll enjoy a book, but they might be the reason why when you're done, you say you love it. And that's that disconnect there. But that makes sense again, based upon the information present to you when you're looking to purchase your next book.
One of the things that was a takeaway for me on this is this validating this whole idea of barrier to entry to barrier to exit that I talk about. That initially, as an author that's trying to bring in a new customer, that author loyalty is like a barrier to entry, right? People would rather go read a book of an author they know, maybe even reread a book from an author they know, versus using that time to discover a new author. But once you do win them over, you have them kind of trapped, right? They're now going to put you in that category like, I'd rather read this person than other people. So thinking about that as part of your initial marketing and trying to, think about how you can help them mitigate that risk to take that chance for an experience, right? Because it's that reading of the book that sells that book, gets them over the hurdle, and sells the rest of your books.
Right. And what we saw a lot of is, when people had to get over that hurdle, there's a couple different things that they talked about. One is time. People, even if a book is free, we see people don't buy it a lot of times or don't get it because they say, this is going to be 10 hours of my life. Do I really want to invest 10 hours in a book I'm not going to like? So even if you change your pricing, everything, you look at that hurdle and it can still be quite large. So there's different areas that people determine whether or not it's going to be worth their time. What you're really hedging up against is their time, is the fact that they're going to have to give you that much of their life to figure out whether or not they enjoy it. And that's the risk that they take. Dollars are sometimes included as well, but that was really secondary in what we noticed. Next, we have what makes you decide that a book is a favorite. And what we saw here was an emphasis again on characters and story. And then we also saw ending in here as well. So if you can really finish a book with a fantastic ending, that's what's going to make people say, wow, I love this. This is something I want to come back to. And we also saw a lot of information about gripping or things that are saying, I can't stop reading. I'm really engaged. But this is the type of book, that makes you stay up to 3 a.m. You have to know what's next. It's a page turner, was what we also heard there as well. And then one thing interesting is we have the question of what makes you, or what do you feel is often overlooked by authors? Again, we got characters and story were two of the huge things that popped out here. People saying that, the characters didn't get enough attention, they weren't fleshed out enough, they weren't strong, it didn't really capture me. And the same thing with the story. If the story doesn't have information or it doesn't have enough of an arc, or it's something that you can tell was just kind of thrown together, those are things that they, really feel are overlooked at times. But something else is interesting too is if you remember earlier on, we said that people aren't going to recommend a book based upon editing, based upon pricing, or things along those lines. But here they are saying that oftentimes grammar, spelling, writing quality, editing, and errors are things that they feel are overlooked. Especially, when we look at indie publishing and a lot of people that are going indie, they may not, have a specific editor that they work with. They may not have the resources that a publishing house has. And these are the things that people are often saying are overlooked or not included in their books. The next question was, what would make you immediately stop buying a book? And what was interesting is if you were an older reader, you actually said price. So if you remember, in general, price didn't have a big effect. But if you are an older reader, that is something that they say applies and actually makes them potentially stop reading a book. The other things as well were there are people that said R-rated material, so sex, language, violence. Remember, again, this is a small subset that's saying this, so that's not everyone. That is just a piece of our results. They're probably more vocal, but that is something that we did see pop out. Use in the description. And what this means again is if you have a cover that looks like it was made in Microsoft Paint, right? Or you have something that just looks slapped together, or it's pixel art or something else that you just look at, you immediately know that there wasn't a lot of effort behind it, you might be concerned about what's inside the book as well. Same thing with reviews. If you see a lot of 1-star reviews or reviews that look kind of sketchy, you're probably not likely to buy it. And then description is important too, because remember, people are going in, they're going to read the description, and that's what's going to determine whether or not they move forward. So if their description is not fleshed out enough, or if it's something that immediately just doesn't apply to them as a reader, that could also make them leave too. And Joe, if we could, thank you. And then we also had, what could an author do to help you evaluate a book? And we come back to the theme here of the surface level information. We want better covers, we want better blurbs, description. Purchase a book, you're not just looking at one thing. It's very rare for someone to just look at a cover and say, I'd love that book, or just to read a review, or just to actually read a description. It's the combination of all these that convince you whether or not a book is worth your time and whether or not you want to put the investment in, because it is a quite lengthy investment of your time, and you want to make sure before you jump over that hurdle that everything is in accordance and you can go forward. And Joe, that covers us again for this presentation here. If you want, we can go into some of the very genre specific different areas, or we can take some time now to answer different questions and see what people were thinking.
Maybe we pick one or two genre specific ones, and then we'll go to questions. Is there one that you thought, like, of the genre stuff that we looked at, that you thought was like, wow,
Yeah,
really
just
didn't
scroll through. You'll
expect
see a
this?
couple of pages. Mhm. Scroll through. You'll see a couple of pages where there's a single graph, and pick one of those. And you can just go. It'll be pretty obvious if you just start flicking through the slides.
So, like this one, clean romance.
No, where there's a. So go to the next. Keep going. You'll see just one graph.
Just one graph.
Yep, hard sci-fi should have one. Yep, right here. So this one was interesting. Hard science fiction. I mean, when you think about it, as far as education level goes, this is one that we thought was really interesting when we did a deep dive. If you think about hard science fiction, these are things where they're going to go a lot more into the science and math. They're not going to gloss over details that might be in just a surface level science fiction. They're not going to gloss over something and just say, hey, this happened because technology. They're going to go through and they're going to actually say, well, X plus 2 equals this or something. And they go and dive in or go into the materials or really get into it. And what's interesting that we saw, and this is something, you would expect, But as you increase in age, your education level goes up. And part of that is because as your age increases, your chances of having a higher education goes up as well, simply because if you're 18, you probably don't have a PhD. But we saw this occur where people enjoyed science fiction more and more as they got older based upon their education level. So more educated people tended to gravitate towards science fiction as they got older, which I thought was really interesting and really underscores, when you're in that hard sci-fi category, there are people that probably want to read a book that almost reads like a PhD paper.
Yeah,
There's a
yeah,
couple.
for sure.
Yep. I mean, I know some that they're like, hey, if there's a tiny little plot hole and about the way light moves, they'll be really angry about that book for years to come. And that's what they enjoy, and they love the effort that goes into it. If you jump ahead, there's a couple more of these that are single slides.
So lit RPG.
Yep, this one is really interesting. So one thing we notice as well is that males tend to enjoy lit RPG far more, but there's this really interesting spike when you look at education. And we see that in the range there, the second one from 32 to 40, there is a huge spike of education from people that are in high school, or not in high school, but have only had a high school education. So when we look at that, I mean, I know a lot of people that enjoy lit RPG, and what I've heard from a lot of them is that they are from the military. And part of me wonders, and I don't know if that's the case or not, but that might be a really popular genre in the military. And that would be a really interesting question to ask in the future, Joe, is, have you served or are you a veteran or something along those lines? Because I think there are certain books that really appeal to them, especially because lit RPG, I know it's fantasy, but it does have a lot of times things to do with battles and military things along the line. So I thought that one was really interesting again because there's such a hard spike at that age level that is occurring. And we can see that as well, even in the 41 to 55 area. But
Cool.
again, that is all a guess, right? We really don't know why that's occurring. That's just based upon my anecdotal experience.
Yeah. So before we go to questions, I want to show folks a few things. First off, if you want to get this data, go to joesolari.com and sign up for access to the data. If you participated in the survey, you probably already have a login to get into the data, and you're welcome to use that. If you forgot your password, there's a thing to reset it, and you'll actually be sent to this page, Keystone Results, where you can fill that information in. But if you're new to this, sign up on the page. There's no cost. You'll get access to the data. In the future, we're going to ask you to participate in this and share the survey. The idea is that we keep growing this thing bigger and bigger so that we can start killing some of these biases off. So, again, joesolari.com is where you would go. And just in that first section there, sign up. If you have any issues, just email me and we'll get you in there. It'll be probably later today. We'll get Hank's deck loaded up in there. Right now, there is some synopsis material, and there is the raw CVS file, or CSV file. Sorry,
Yep.
not the pharmacy.
One thing that's important to note, Joe, is that so if you all go through and you try to recreate the graphs I have, bear in mind we did clean the data before I went through. So your results might look a little different. That's because we went and there are certain areas that we scrubbed out. For example, if someone went through and they only answered one question, they might not be included in the whole data set simply because it's going to skew the data one way or the other. So we went through, we did a lot of cleaning. So if you see things that don't quite line up, that is why there might be a little bit of.
So I'm going to put some questions up here. Either you or I can answer these. So here's one from Takiri. So are book prices elastic or inelastic?
I would say that our data can't quite cover that too much. I mean, what we did see some of that behavior occurring with older audiences, and that's something that is self-reported. Like someone might go in, they say, "I would never buy an expensive book," but then they go and do. So until we have unless we have that specific data on what they do, I would answer from this data set. It's very hard to tell, but older audiences do say that it's going to act in I forget which one's which, but it's going to act in a way that's going to discourage potential purchases. But we saw with younger audiences that if they have a book they like or it's the same author, that they're willing to pay significantly more to get that same author.
Now I know from pricing exercises that we've done, um, books, there's no demand response to price changes, and you can run this experiment yourself, and you can see it in a situation where you say you do a 99-cent deal. Unless you're doing something along with that, like running a promotion with, say, BookBub or some other deal that may be bringing more volume, you'll rarely see the demand response to that price reduction, right? Because in that case, I think roughly if you're selling your book for $3.99, you need to sell 8 times the number of books um, at 99 cents because of the margin change to get to the same profit. So that's one way of looking at elasticity. The other part is I've observed in clients raising their prices, they get more profitable, right? So whatever customer loss there may be, or people driving into KU if they're doing that, the end result at the business level is they become more profitable. What else do we have here? If you guys have any other questions, please just put them in the comments. I should be able to see them. Some of the folks from Facebook, let's see. Here's Alice. Let's try this one. I write Clean Cozy Mysteries set in the UK. My audience is release Cozy set in New Orleans. It's not actually. Is there a question there?
The last, what audience do you suggest she targets
Yeah.
with the series? Um, I think a lot of that depends upon your style, and a lot of that depends upon your readership. So remember, again, I mean, a lot of this is just going to depend upon what they search. With Christian fiction, again, we saw that it was highly it looks like they're getting it out of the category, or it looks like they're getting it from, they're going into Christian fiction and looking through there. So I would argue that if you had spiritualism, you still had, that Christian fiction aspects to it, I would say you're probably, I mean, I don't know, you may be good with that same audience, but if you're saying that not a lot of people are responding, you may want to double check and just ask a couple of them and find out. Because with this generalized data, we might not be able to dive down and necessarily determine it, but asking your reader base and saying, hey, what makes you really enjoy this or not, could give that answer. Because it could be something as simple as them saying, hey, I love the covers of your past books, but maybe this cover looked different and it wasn't something I was used to. It could be something there. It's very difficult to tell what may or may not be encourage them to read it or to move away from it.
So we're going to wrap this up soon, unless we have some folks have some more questions or comments on the data. Um, Hank, it's been a pleasure working with you on this project.
Absolutely wonderful. And again, just remember when we're looking through this data, this is all self-reported. We're just taking the numbers that people have entered in and just seeing how they're different. So that can have biases and everything else can happen. But this should be a pretty good general indicator to help people understand that market.
Great. And, I really appreciate that you guys did that. We never could have pulled this off without, you specifically and the resources of Kindlepreneur helping us to do this. Um, I always know Dave had uh, talented people there, and then when he hired you, it was like, oh, he really does actually know what he's doing.
Hey, we really appreciate it. I mean, and especially when you look at a lot of the projects we have forward, we're really diving the data. And when you talk about looking at what people enjoy, looking at what next books they might come up with, there's a lot of things that they can go into. And I mean, we really are starting to look deep into that data to help authors out because it's things that haven't always been available. And we want to make sure that it's not just, the big publishing houses that get this data, but also, the independent authors, because a lot of it isn't very accessible and we want to make it accessible.
Yeah, so we got another question here, and then I want to bounce back to what you just said. But did you guys get any information on formats such as audio, ebooks, or paperback?
We did not. And that's a great thing I think we should ask next time around, Joe, is really to find out what drives those. Because, I mean, there are absolutely different audiences there. I know for me personally, I don't read a lot of ebook. I read mainly paperback, but I'm a huge audio guy. And there's other people that will say, hey, I don't want to hold a book around. I want something I can easily carry on a plane. And that's going to be your Kindle. So I absolutely think we would see a very strong relationship between those based upon age or based upon demographics. I really think that we would see some interesting data there. So maybe next year when we run this, we can grab that.
Yeah, I think given some of the folks that we would have participating in this, there would be some really significant differences in how that data would look when you see, you know, and I know for a fact from my work with my clients is, you know, males tend to be audio focused, right? And those businesses, lit RPGs, science
Mm-hmm.
fiction, fantasy, where you have a larger male audience, we're getting those business where 50% or more of the profits are driven by audio. Even though
Absolutely, I agree. Mhm.
like 5 years ago, it was all ebook.
What I think is interesting too is because we see those differences in age and other demographic information, I think you would absolutely see it by genre as well. Where you could say, lit RPG, like you just mentioned, um, could have a huge spike in audio, whereas something such as a cozy mystery might be only paperback, which is really going to affect that strategy that you have. I mean, I know a lot of people that publish in those lit RPG areas, and some of them say it's barely worth it for me to make a paperback. And the reason why is they don't have a lot of people that go out and buy it. And you just see that difference based upon who your market is and what they like to read.
So Jennifer's got a question here about be interested in how people feel about buying direct from the author. Actually, last year we asked those questions, and that data you'll have access to when you sign up. So we have last year's results in there too, and we had specific questions around buying direct. We also had getting back to Carrie. We had questions by genre of price point. So there was a heat map that we generated in that material. So it's more of your kind of um, typical survey where you see things like that, like what's the most you pay for a book, what's the least you pay, do you like to buy, do you like to KU, all that stuff. So I would, Jennifer, I would go look at that information. It's a year old. Um, I think that you know there would have to be some thought in how you know what's happened with COVID and the shift people went through during that period. We had a pretty significant move of people prepared to not only buy things online but buy from not traditional stores. There was a big shift there. So maybe some of that information isn't as relevant as it was a year ago, but it's there.
Something huge, yeah, and something huge as well is, I mean, when you talk about buying directly from the author, it's that author loyalty, and we saw that come up time and time again in our questions. So there may be a higher hurdle, maybe not, depending upon what you found, Joe. But what we do see over and over again is that people follow authors, and if they have an author that produces a quality product that they love and gets them hooked, then they're going to go and buy that author time and time again, which means that you can have a higher barrier to entry there.
Yeah, so we're getting some comments here, but they look more like things that we should be writing down for. We'll go
Next
through
year,
and write down for questions for next year. They're all really good questions, and please keep uh, putting them in the comments or just emailing them to me so that we can do this. I mean, the idea of this is to over time build up a resource for the indie community to tap into whatever the zeitgeist of the industry is, right? Like we can't forget where all the money comes from is readers or listeners. It's not Amazon, it's not Barnes and Noble, it's not Shopify. It's that connection that you have with your audience and them seeing, we talked about earlier that they're prepared to pay money and their time for this experience you're going to give them. Cool. Um, Anything else you want to share, Hank, before we wrap up?
no, I think that closes it. But like you said, I'm excited about hearing other questions. I mean, every time we do this, I think we're going to find out new opportunities or new things that we can ask. And who knows what future years will bring, right? This is what we see now, but there might be a question that comes up next year that we couldn't predict at all. Who knows what will be here in 2024? So, it's important to stay up to date with this. The market changes and it can change quick. So, I'm really interested in finding out what we ask next year and again, what new things that are going to pop up.
Awesome. And to the audience, thank you so much for taking the time out on a Friday afternoon to watch us geek out on data. And again, if you go to joesolari.com on that front page there's a spot for you to log in or get your access to log into that area and play around with that data. It's you guys help create it, and we want you guys to have it open source to do what you want to do with it. One last piece on that: those of you that participated, you do know that we at one point asked for an email address from your people because we offer the chance to win $100 gift card. There's 3 of them that we give away, and we don't use those emails for anything. In fact, I delete them. I don't want them to mess up my list, and I don't want you to feel that we would do anything with those. The only thing we do is we randomize 3 names, pick those 3 emails out, and then reach out to them and say, "Hey, you won." So those names never leave the surveys. And if you go to the data set, those emails are not there. All you're going to see is just the raw data with a signifier, unique identity code that is created. So wanted to cover that for people to know their data is, if they participate in this, is their list is not going to get misused. And frankly, I'm not interested in these emails at all. So that's my last point. Hank, have a great weekend.
Thanks so much, Joe. Really
All
appreciate
right.
it.
Talk to you guys later.